Hello friends, and welcome to your painting class. The way I've set up this course is that all of the information you're going to need is going to be put right onto a PowerPoint presentation. So everything that I would teach you in class, everything I would say, everything I would show you is going to be right there on that PowerPoint, so you can just click through and do it yourself. It'll be just like how it would be in the classroom environment. The only reason I'm doing these videos is because if you are an auditory learner and that's how you prefer to get information and that's how you soak it in the best, I'm going to read what's on these PowerPoints to you. I'm not going to be giving you extra information that's not already on there. So if you are not an auditory learner and you do not need somebody to read the information out loud to you, you do not need to watch these videos. You can just go straight to the PowerPoint presentation and read it all on your own, okay? So it's up to you how you want to take in this information. You can just watch the PowerPoint or you can listen to the audio as well, okay? So for our first unit, we're going to be doing watercolor. That means for the next several weeks, we're going to be focusing on just watercolor painting. So you will need a watercolor palette of your own in order to complete these activities, okay? So today we're going to learn the watercolor painting basics. What is watercolor painting? Watercolor painting is painting with water added to a colored pigment. There are a variety of styles of painting, and it appears in many cultures throughout history. Watercolor provides a delicate feel to paper and is very different compared to other mediums of paint. So some tools you're going to need are a variety of watercolor paint brushes or soft-haired brushes, watercolor paper, watercolor paint, which can come in palette, tubes, pencils, or crayons, a container for water, and then you might also want to have some rubbing alcohol, salt, wax resistant, or gum to help you create some cool effects that we're going to talk about. Two things to remember are watercolor paint is unpredictable. Water can run into other colors, it can bleed, its pigments can mix together and create colors you didn't intend. So you have to let yourself be spontaneous. Let it go, go with the flow. Dark paint is always laid over light paint. Plan your image first so you can work from the background to the foreground or lights to dark. Okay, the reason for that is because you cannot paint a light color over a dark color. It's not going to show up, right? So always start in the background and with your lighter colors first. Here you can see an example of a wet on wet technique and a dry brush technique, a flat watercolor wash, and a graded watercolor wash. If you hear weird noises in the background, I apologize. I do have dogs and sometimes they make noise. So the wet on dry technique, this is your classic watercolor technique. It's when you have a dry piece of paper and you take a wet brush and paint onto that surface. Okay, it's very easy to control. It's definitely the most popular for beginners. Wet on wet technique is whenever you take a wet piece of paper and then you add the wet colored pigment onto the paper. Okay, so this is the color is gonna bleed across the paper when you apply it. So as you add pigment to the water covered paper, you'll notice that the pigment will immediately bleed across your paper, creating effects that are beyond your control. This is not a technique to use if you're a control freak and you want to make sure the paint goes exactly where you want it. Once you finish and the paper dries, you will notice that you'll have a watery or ghostly image that is neither itself or a part of the background. It has a very different feel to wet on dry technique. This technique allows colors to blend together. A gradient wash. This wash creates a background where the colors blend from dark to light. It's a great background for a landscape or a water scene. This requires you to pre-mix 3 saturations of one color. Paint is applied to wet paper to allow the saturations to bleed together. So when I'm talking about saturations, I'm talking about the dark and the medium and the light here. So you're going to start with your first saturation. Your mixes will have less or more water to create darker or lighter versions of the pigment. Apply your first in a line across the top, and this image has the darkest version of the pigment. And then you're going to apply the medium saturated pigment under the first. So you're going to slowly they're going to slowly bleed together and erase that line. So the way you make it lighter it's by adding more water. And the lightest pigment is applied at the bottom. This completes the gradient wash. When it's dry, it has a lovely look. A flat wash is a background painted with a pigment of the same saturation across the entire surface. This is the most basic background and requires only one mixture of pigment. So you're going to start with your background like you did with your graded wash, and you're going to horizontally drag your brush across the top. Using the same mixture, apply the second layer directly beneath the first stroke. The paint will even itself out to cover the lines. This should be done immediately after the first brush so that the paint doesn't dry. The third stroke will complete the surface. You will need to wait till the paper dries before continuing to paint your image. The pigment will lighten once dried, so keep that in mind. Here's an example of it dry where it's lighter. See that? A backwash or blend of colors is a great method to create an interesting texture or background, playing with your mucky water or leftover pigment. Apply your murky water to the paper, then add different pigments. Let them swirl and blend, and when they dry, they'll be a beautiful experiment. The drip and splatter texture is a fun texture to create. Choose one or more pigments, and with your brush, throw your paint at the dry surface. Alternatively, you can find an old toothbrush and spray paint at the paper. Let the pigment dry where it is. Please be careful if you choose to do this at home. I am not liable for any mess you make. Dry brush texture, with more pigment and very little water, paint on the dry surface. The brush will leave textured marks on the paper. Think of creative ways in which this can be used to add texture on your paintings. Tissue lifting texture is when you apply pigment and let it dry just a little bit, and then when it appears that it's soaked into the paper but it's still wet, take tissue paper and lift some of the pigment off the paper. It will leave interesting marks and textures, and it's great for a background or on top of a flat wash. Now this is where we talked about some other ingredients that you could throw in. That's salt texture. Apply your pigment to your dry surface, make sure it's watery, and use table salt. Shake it onto the paint, and it will pull in areas and draw the water to it. Let it sit there. It'll look uninteresting at first, but when it dries completely and the salt is hard on the paper, scrape the salt off. Now you'll be able to see the lovely texture left behind. This texture takes time, so plan for it when you plan your composition. Rubbing alcohol texture. Apply the mixture of pigments of your choice. With your finger or cotton swab, drip rubbing alcohol onto the pigment. Immediately, the pigment will rush away from the alcohol and leave the wonderful swirl that will dry into a great texture. Sgraffito texture. Apply your pigment and let it soak the paper. With an open paper clip or push pin, scratch the surface of the paper. It's important that the paper is thick so it does not rip. Sponging texture. Instead of using a paintbrush, dip a sponge into the pigment. Apply the sponge to your dry surface and let it dry to create a wonderful surface. And here's an example of all of these interesting techniques that I just showed you.